Good afternoon. Today I will be presenting to you a presentation on the argument from design. We can call this the teleological argument. We're going to ask the question today, does our world show intelligent design? I'm going to look at a few people who believe it does, and I am one of those people. When we look at the word teleological, what we see is the Greek word teleo, meaning end. There are many people who have been adherents to this argument. And we're going to talk about a few of them today. We're going to talk about one a couple hundred years ago and some modern people who believe this today. In fact, this argument is not new. It goes all the way back and to Thomas Aquinas. It probably goes back before that with roots, but he was one of the first Christian advocates of this that I am aware of. And his the fifth way, we know that there is a God, is that when we study the end or the end goal was for a purpose. He talked about that in his fifth way, that just like an arrow that is shot from a bow, the world has a goal that it means to hit. And when we know that something is propelled with a purpose that way, it points us back to a purpose giver. He doesn't use those exact words, but that's similar to what his argument is. We're going to look at a little bit of a different slant on the same teleological argument today. Our journey is going to start with a man named William Paley. Paley was a theologian in the 1800s, and he is credited with what we call Paley's Watchmaker argument. Paley presents a scenario where he is taking a walk and he notices a rock and then notices a watch on the ground. This is how he words it. Suppose I found a watch on the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. Yet, why should not this answer serve for the watch as well for a stone that happened to be lying on the ground? For this reason and no other, that namely, if the parts had been differently shaped from what they are, if a different size from what they are, or placed in a different manner, or in any order than that which they were placed, either no motion at all would have been carried on in the machine, or none would have been answered the use that is now served by it. So remember, watches at that time looked, and you could still find them this way, but they look quite a bit different than the watches we have today. We often have digital watches, whether it's in our car, on our microwave, or on our wrist. They're digital. But in those times, the watches were often pocket watches, and they were set about with gears that moved, wheels and gears that moved it, and that would move the hands and tell time. When Paley sees this, he's seeing that it has two functions that indicate result of intelligent design. The first one is that performs a function that an intelligent agent would regard as valuable. Second, the watch could not perform this very function if the parts and mechanism were differently sized or arranged. The fact that the ability of a watch to keep the time depends on the precise shape, size, and arrangement of its parts. This suggests that the watch had these characteristics. Why? Because some intelligent agency designed it to specifications. Remember the specificity. It's going to be very important in our talk today. Taken together, these two characteristics endow the watch with a functional complexity that reliably distinguishes objects that have intelligent designers from those who do not. Nobody would say this watch just came about. Everybody's going to say somebody made this watch and they made it for a purpose. So Paley goes on to say, every indicator of contrivance, every manifestation of design which existed in the watch exists in the work of nature, with the difference on the side of nature being greater and more, and that in the degree which exceeds all computation. I mean that the contrivances of nature surpass the contrivances of art in the complexity, subtlety, and curiosity of the mechanism. And still more, if possible, do they go beyond them in number, variety, yet in a multitude of cases are not less evidentially mechanical, not less evidentially contrivances, not less evidently accommodated to their end or suited to their office than are the most perfect productions of human ingenuity. What he is saying here is that in nature, we see things that go so far beyond a simple watch, that this watch tells us something has made it. Therefore, the things that we see in the universe that are even more complex should also point us to a designer. We can put his arguments in some simple terms here. He says, all designs imply a designer. There is great design in the universe. Therefore, there must be a great designer of the universe. That brings us to the question, well, what about today? You know, our world today, we know even more about it than we know then. Are we wrong now? Well, let's check this out. Who talks about this today? We're going to talk about a few of these people. Since Paley's day, we've come to know more about the world around us, and this allows apologists to use this information in pointing to a universe designed by God. Among other people, we have these people, J. Warner Wallace, Hugh Ross, Michael Behe, and Stephen Meyer. Now, Wallace is not a scientist, but he is and has had a long career as a cold case detective. He is fascinating because he looks at the universe, the world, our bodies, everything, the way one would a crime scene. He takes all the evidences we see in the world around us and shows us in the same way that detectives would be working a homicide case, we can see evidence that points to a creator or a designer. He is fascinating. I highly recommend his books. I'll tell you a little bit more about it later. With Hugh Ross, he is a Christian astrophysicist. He is the founder and president of Reasons to Believe Ministries. As an astrophysicist, Hugh Ross writes about how the universe shows much evidence of design. He has a new book out called Design to the Core. This is written, it's a little bit harder to understand than some of Wallace's work, but it is fascinating. It just takes some time to understand what he's saying in each one. Then we have Stephen Meyer. He's a Cambridge-educated philosopher of science. Meyer is the director of the Center of Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute. This place is intelligence design's primary intellectual and scientific headquarters. He's the author of a book called Signature in the Cells. It's a provocative book that offers the first comprehensive DNA-based argument for intelligent design. You see all from Paley, actually from Aquinas to Paley, even though their arguments were different, from Aquinas to Paley, all the way to today, we see people looking at the evidence of design in our world and being pointed to creator. Michael Behe is another one who does this. He is a biochemist. He argues for intelligent design and wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. Behe advocates for the validity of the argument from irreducible complexity. That is the claim that some biochemical structures are too complex to be explained by what is understood right now by evolutionary mechanisms. And therefore, in all probability, he comes out with that they are the result of intelligent design instead. So these are 4 people out of many who take up this argument today. Hopefully, by knowing these people, you can get more information if you like. If you start with them and you Google each of their names, you'll find their websites or their ministries, and you can find out all the information that you're interested in. We're going to talk a little bit more about this. This brings us to the question, what things in our universe indicate design today? What do you think? We're going to talk about 3 of those. There's three things that we're going to focus on for today. Our universe, we're going to talk about the Goldilocks zone, DNA, and bacterial flagellum. We're going to go all the way out there, all the way to inside of us today. We're going to go out to the universe and all the way back in. We're going to start here with something called the Goldilocks zone. Most of you are familiar with Goldilocks and the three bears. She enters, well, she's pretty much guilty of breaking and entering now, isn't she? So she goes into the three bears' home and they're gone. She sits down to eat their porridge and she finds Papa Bear's is too hot and Mama Bear's is too cold, but Baby Bear's porridge is just right. And that goes along with the story. So this just right is considered the Goldilocks zone. And we're going to talk about that today. This is from an article on Apologetics Press, if you would like to find it. And you can just look on their website under Goldilocks zone. So there is, when we talk about this, one atheistic philosopher, Paul Ritchie, actually, he summed up the teleological argument. And it's something he has to come up against. And he says, it is true that everything designed has a designer. Everything designed has a designer is an analytically true statement. He continues, there are an infinite number of examples of design that present themselves to us when we study the natural realm. This ends up being a problem for Ritchie and other atheistic scholars. Now, that doesn't mean they come to the same conclusion, but this idea that the universe looks like it's designed is problematic for them. And there was an article in National Geographic titled One Strange Rock, 13 Things That Make Life on Earth Possible. And we're going to talk about a few of those. We can't go into all 13, but just a few of these should give you a taste. And if you want to do some more information, you can. Or if you want to do some more research yourself, you could. This should give you a starting place. So let's look at a few of those. Let's look at the rotation axis of the Earth. So if the Earth was tilted slightly differently, a change in the rotation axis of the Earth would be catastrophic. The number of seasons would change and the duration. If the rotation axis became parallel to the orbital plane, as it is for Uranus, we would have winter in the northern hemisphere for 6 months, followed by summer. The sun would set in the entire northern hemisphere and not rise again for 6 months. I don't think it takes a scientist to know that that would be very bad. That 6 months of no sun would not be good for any of us. There are parts of the world that experience no sun for a couple months at a time, and that is very difficult on the people living there. This would impact not only our quality of life, but even life just being here. Let's look at what happened if the Earth was spinning faster. So how fast we spin, that is highly regulated. If the Earth was spinning faster, hurricanes would also spin faster, and there would be more energy in them. I will tell you, just a few years ago, less than 2 years ago, this area went through Hurricane Ian, and it hit very hard. And it actually, where I was, it came over us as a Category 3. But where it hit just shy of, I think about 5 miles shy of a Category 5 hurricane, about 30 miles south of where I live right now. The devastation that was caused was horrific. I cannot imagine these hurricanes moving faster and being even more powerful. It would be deadly for people. People were lost, and from personal experience, you know a hurricane is coming at you. And one of the things you're seeing before this happened is homes floating down streets. This is not something we would want. And so a human and animal life would actually be forced to live closer to the poles, to each of the poles, and it would cause catastrophic extinctions. If the Earth's orbit was actually closer to the sun by only about 0.3%, it would cause disastrous atmospheric changes, including sea level rise and increases in extreme weather. We don't want that. species extinction, and agricultural disruptions. The Earth bends when it's making its orbit around the sun. The Earth bends from its straight course only 1/9 of an inch every 18.5 miles. 1/9 of an inch. Now, get this. If the orbital changed by 1/10 of an inch every 18 miles, our orbit would be vastly larger and we would freeze to death. 1/8 of an inch, we would all be incinerated. In fact, the Earth's perfect distance from the sun is called the Goldilocks zone, the Goldilocks zone, where it is not too close and not too far from the sun for water to be liquid on its surface. Earth's temperature is not too hot or too cold. That is the Goldilocks zone. We are in it. It was only less than an inch. I mean, I move my computer by an inch all the time. If the Earth had less water, we would also be devastated. There's about 75% of the Earth is coated in water right now. If there was less water, there would be just drastic temperature changes like we see in the desert. It would be extremely hot during the day and extremely cold at night. Most of the Earth doesn't have this problem, thankfully, and this is because there is so much water on it. Water can store a lot of heat or lose a lot of heat without its temperature being drastically changed. This means it acts a bit like an air conditioner unit for the Earth. It keeps the temperature relatively constant. A different liquid or less water would make the Earth inhospitable for life. Well, it goes on to say if we were like other planets, we would not have the ozone layer that we have that keeps us from having harmful rays. We have a big moon that stabilizes what's called our axial wobble. There's varied surfaces on the Earth for various forms of life. There's a magnetic field that deflects solar tempest. The Earth is situated safely away from gas giants. If it were closer, their gravity would pull us into them, and again, we would not be in that Goldilocks zone anymore. Also, the star of our solar system, the sun, is a stable, long-lasting star, as opposed to less massive, younger stars that are often unstable and are prone to blasting their planets with bursts of radiation. Very glad we do not have that in our sun. Earth has the right stuff to host a dynamic core. That is sufficient radioactive elements to generate a churning core and a protective magnetic field that could last for a long period of time. It goes on, this article goes on, and this was all on Apologetics Press, don't forget. It goes on to tell us that the planets around us absorb some of the debris that could come at us and knock us out of the sky. It sums up by saying, truly, the Earth is just right for us, as though it was made for humans. The article goes on to say that there are dozens of these examples. And there was even a skeptic writer, Michael Shermer. He's not a Christian. And he wrote in A Scientific America, the design inference comes naturally. The reason people think that a designer created the world is because it looks designed. We agree with that statement. When what we see in the world is it looks like design. Right, so we have another article. So that's all the way out in the universe. The world, our Earth is just right. So what about inside of us? We're going to take a look all the way out there, all the way in here. We're going to look at the DNA, the strand of DNA. And this is where Stephen Meyer writes some, and he's a very interesting person. And I wish we had time to go way deep into what he says. I do have a DNA strand here on the slide. Let's look at this argument. He had an interview with Biola, and this was some of the things he said in his interview. He says the main argument is fairly straightforward about DNA. We know that what runs the show in biology is what we call digital information or digital code. This was first discovered by James Watson and Francis Crick. In 1957, Crick had an insight which he called the sequence hypothesis. And it was the idea that along the spine of the DNA molecule, there were four chemicals that function just like an alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in a machine code. The DNA molecule is literally encoding information. Catch that word, encoding, because what we know from experience, or I'm sorry, I lost my place there. Encoding information into alphabetic or digital form. And this, he says, is hugely significant discovery because what we know from experience is that information always comes from intelligence. Again, just like the watch, it came from intelligence. When we see code, that tells us there was a code maker. I've known people who have developed codes and they will write to each other. That comes from intelligence. When scientists are able to sit down and archaeologists, and when they pull something out, they know when something was some type of alphabet because it shows that it is code. If we trace, he says, whether we're talking about hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or a headline on a paper, always shows that it comes from intelligence. If we trace the information back to its source, it comes to a mind, not a material process. So the discovery that DNA encodes information in a digital form points decisively back to a prior intelligence. And that's the main argument of his book if you want to learn more. I'm going to move on. I wish we had time to go into that more, but we don't. We're going to keep going into a third area, and it's called bacterial flagellum. This is a fascinating thing, and I want to show you on the next slide. I want you to notice what it looks like inside this tiny thing. This is what it's going to look like, and this is so interesting. J. Warner Wallace actually calls this the poster child for an external intelligent cause that's related to the design that we observe in molecular organisms. Why does he think this is the poster child? Well, let's define it first. A flagellum is a hair-like appendage that protrudes from certain plant and animal sperm cells, from fungal spores, and from a wide range of microorganisms to provide mobility, movement. Remember, just like that watch, the movement. Many protists with phalange are known as phalangates. A microorganism may have from one to many phalangia. So some of these bacteria swim by rotating this flagellum. I forgot how to pronounce it for a minute. I wrote it down, flagellum. And when they do, it turns like a motor. And that is what's fascinating. Why is this fascinating? Well, if you think about it, if you took a rubber band and you twisted and twisted and twisted and twisted it in one direction, at some point that's going to break. Instead, if there is a motor that can turn it and keep it turning around, it will not have that tension point where it breaks off. So some of these flagellum need to, some of these bacteria have to have movement, and they do it by rotating the flagellum that you can see here. Now, here's the cell. On the left slide, you see the bottom of the cell, and at the base of the cell, before you get to the flagellum, you see what looks like a motor. I don't know a lot about cars, but what we see is a rotator, we see pinions, and we see that it can go in a circle. I don't know a lot about cars, but I do know that this rendition here on the left looks a lot like what I have seen under the hood. I don't know what they do, but that looks a lot like what is in my engine, and it has a fan belt attached to the outside and allows my motor to continually turn without breaking off. And I love this artist's depiction of what it looks like under a microscope and how they rotate without breaking anything off. I see the evidence of design in what that looks like. The rods and the rings look very clearly to be a designed machine. I believe that they have apparent design. I think that these three things, where we see the Goldilocks zone, we see the DNA, the code on the DNA, and we see all the way down to the motor that drives this bacterial flagellum. I see that as a lot of evidence that points us to a designer of the universe. If evolution were not presented when we would see these things, they would tell us there was a designer. So that brings us to our next question. Does the evolutionary theory, or does the theory of evolution explain all of these appearances of design? And that's something each person's going to have to look at. And what many have said is that Paley's version of this argument, of the teleological argument, is thought to have been refuted by Charles Darwin's competing explanation for complex organisms. In The Origin of the Species, Darwin argued that more complex and biological organisms evolved gradually over millions of years from simpler organisms through a process called natural selection. Does this argument work? That's what we want to ask. Does this argument against design work? Well, for many it doesn't, and Behe is one of those it does not work for. The way Behe refutes Darwin, it says that the probability of evolving in irreducibly complex systems along Darwinian lines is sufficiently small that it can be ruled out as an explanation of the irreducible complexity. He says an irreducibly complex system cannot be produced by slight successive modifications of a precursor system. Why? Because any precursor to an irreducibly complex system that is missing a part is by definition non-functional. Since natural selection can only choose systems that are already working, if a biological system cannot be produced gradually, it would have to arise as an integrated unit in one fell swoop for natural selection to be anything to act on. What he's saying is there are many things that you cannot reduce any further and still have a working mechanism. They couldn't come up, okay, one at a time because they all work together. Therefore, they'd all have to come about at once. They weren't slight, small modifications. If you had two of the three things, this wouldn't work. Well, those two things would die off. That is his point, is in Darwin's evolutionary theory, if something's not useful, you lose it. So you wouldn't just have these two things that kind of came about, then the third one comes about, and all of a sudden it works, because the ones that didn't work would be lost. And I agree with him there. The probability of these appearing all at once are so insanely small that it can be ruled out as having happened. Now, scientists will still often claim that this is the way it happened. But I think that when we see design in anything, it points back to a designer. And when we talk of a designer, that is what we call God. All right. So, do you have any questions? I can try to provide some answers if you do. Well, thank you very much for your time. I would like to share with you my resources. These are the websites I used. Apologetics Press had the information on the Goldilocks zone. It was fascinating. Some of my pictures came from the Japanese, phys.org. It had a good picture of the bacteria, the flagium. It's hard to say that. And a few other, I got a few of my other pictures from here. And the last one is an interview on Biola's website which was very interesting. The books I used were God's Crime Scene by J. Warner Wallace, Designed to the Core by Hugh Ross, and Thinking About God by Brian Davies. Thank you so much for your time and have a good evening, a good day.